Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we have been going through answering the objections to Christianity from the atheist.org website. We're currently going through really providing evidence for the New Testament, in particular the Bible. So one of the things that we are going through is the 7 E's. We had come to elaborate testimony, that is testimony that the New Testament documents provide us that are really not, you could not have coordinated it in the fashion that it is put together, which gives it not only authenticity, but the connection between the different eyewitnesses and how the things are laid out and stated obviously shows that they weren't just a mythological story that was put together because it has the marks of genuine eyewitness testimony as opposed to a manufactured story that all the pieces are all buttoned up neatly. We had gone through part 1 of Frank Turek actually explaining elaborate testimony. Now, he did mention in the previous one that the clouds, Jesus coming in clouds, mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, could be seen as the clouds of an army coming to Jerusalem, where Jerusalem was elevated. You could see them coming from a distance. There is various other views on that. I take a much different view. The context of Matthew 24 is actually the tribulation period. Jesus mentions in Matthew 24:15 that the abomination of desolation by the Antichrist, and he references Daniel the prophet, which actually puts you in the context of the tribulation period. Verse 21, a few verses later, Jesus talks about how that's going to be a time that is equal to no other time. Now, you can only have one of those. You can't have 4 or 5 times that are equal to no other time in the history of the planet. So these are indications that he's dealing with the 7-year tribulation period that is yet future. When he does get to the mention, Jesus, of the Son of Man coming in clouds, it is the clouds of heaven. And then he gathers the elect, talking about Israel, the Jews, from the 4 corners of the earth to bring them together and then into the kingdom, which he discusses in chapter 25. But that's another subject for another time. However, I just wanted to give an alternate view to that which Frank Turek had mentioned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now play his part 2 of the elaborate testimony, and that should move us along and help us with a little more evidence for what an elaborate testimony actually is.
How about number 3? Why did Claudius order the Jews out of Rome? You're reading through the book of Acts in Acts chapter 18, and suddenly you read something, Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. And you'll go, where did this come from? Okay. He's the Roman emperor from 41 to 54 AD. And here's what we learn in Luke. He leaves a puzzle. Luke, of course, writes the book of Acts, and right after Paul is on Mars Hill, and he comes down off Mars Hill in Athens, it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, parenthetically, because Claudius commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So Aquila and Priscilla got booted out of Rome. Why? Because Claudius booted all the Jews out of Rome. But why? Who is Claudius, and why did he command the Jews to leave Rome? Suetonius helps solve this. Who's Suetonius? Suetonius is a Roman historian writing about the 12 Caesars. So there were 12 Caesars that he's writing about, and one of the Caesars he's writing about is Claudius. There's a whole book on Claudius. And here's what it says in the book. Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them, Claudius did, from the city. Who is Chrestus? That's another word for Christ. And he, who's he? That's Claudius. Expelled them meaning the Jews, and then from the city, that's what Luke says in Acts chapter 18, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So here you have a Roman historian just parenthetically verifying what Luke has written. Are Luke and Suetonius somehow in cahoots together? No. Luke is writing prior to 62 AD, or about 62 AD, maybe before that. Suetonius is writing in about 117 AD. So they're, what, 50-something years apart. They don't even know each other. But they're given details that interlock. So what's the disturbance? We don't know what the disturbance was, but it could be because, of course, the Jews didn't like the Christians claiming that Jesus is the Messiah, and wherever Paul went, you know, he got into trouble, he got into fights and everything, and apparently the church at Rome may have caused some commotion with the Jews or vice versa. Of course, that's one of the reasons Paul writes the book of Romans, right? He's writing to the church there at Rome. So all this fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, you've got Josephus, now you also have Suetonius, and he's verifying what Luke says because Luke has written Acts. How about Herod? Did Herod really kill John the Baptist? What's the story of John the Baptist? How does he get killed? Herod Antipas, that's this guy. He's the son of Herod the Great, beheaded John the Baptist. This is the guy that Christ stood before. Okay, he beheaded John the Baptist. Why? What did John do that Herod's, this guy, wife didn't like?
Discuss their extramarital arrangement.
Yes. Here's what this guy did. He liked his stepbrother's wife. So he got his stepbrother's wife to marry him. And John the Baptist said, that's an illegitimate marriage. And she didn't like it. So when her daughter, Salome, danced for Herod, he said, I'll give you anything you want up to half my kingdom. And she said, because her mother said in her ear, tell Herod I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so he couldn't go back on his word. He sent the executioner and cut off John's head in prison and brought it to her. Now, how do we even know this name Salome? Is it in any of the Bible? Any of the Bible anywhere? No, you know where it tells us who the name is? Josephus. Josephus tells. There's another verification. All right. So, did he really kill John the Baptist? We know that Mark, Luke, Matthew all say yes. Here's Mark's account. The king, Herod Antipas, was greatly distressed, but because of his oath and dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. Can you imagine that? Isn't that kind of brutal? Here, Mom. Here he is. Now, what does Josephus say about him? Josephus, writing 40 or so years later. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John, that called the Baptist. For Herod killed him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism. So here you got John the Baptist being spoken of by Josephus. Now, is there any way Luke, Mark, or Matthew could have had Josephus 40-something years later write about this? They don't even know this guy. They're dead already. So, now you have Josephus verifying the John the Baptist account. The John the Baptist account appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I want to just do one from the Old Testament. And there are 68 of these in the Old Testament. We're just going to do one. 68 from one book I'll tell you about here in a few minutes. But this is the most intriguing one that I found from the Old Testament. All right? Why did David's trusted counselor become so cruel to David? Who was David's trusted counselor, and why did he become cruel to David? What are we talking about here? Well, Ahithophel is a long-time and respected advisor to David. So much so that in 2 Samuel 16, it says, "Now in those days the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God." That was how both David and Absalom, David's son, regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. It was like talking to God. They thought this guy was the top advisor they had, or one of the top advisors they had, and so this guy was very, very well respected. But then something goes wrong. What goes wrong? First of all, has anyone ever heard of Ahithophel? I've never heard of him. Never heard of him until I started reading this stuff. Who is Ahithophel? Well, let's find out who he is. Well, before we do, we got to figure out what went wrong. Absalom rebels against his father's rule and sends for Ahithophel. Who's Absalom? Anyone know? One of David's sons. Now, David had many wives and concubines. That's just what they did back then. It was not approved of by God. In fact, that's one thing you always have to remember when the skeptics say, well, the Bible had polygamy and concubines. Does that mean God approved it? The Bible records a lot of things God didn't like. That's one of the reasons we know it. They're telling the truth. They're not trying to hide any of their sins. They're just admitting it, as embarrassing as it is. In fact, God says don't multiply wives in Deuteronomy 17:17. It's against God's will, but they did it. And whenever they did it, what happened to them? Disaster. Here's an instance of it. Absalom rebels against his father's rules. Anyone know why Absalom's mad at dad? He's a teenager. No, everybody's mad at dad when they're a teenager. What's the problem? Anyone know? Tamar is raped by his brother, her brother. And they're kind of half-brothers and sisters, and his dad didn't do anything about it. And so Absalom wants to avenge Tamar's rape, and maybe among other things too. So he decides he's actually going to rebel against his father. Never happened, right? Okay. Happens all the time. Here's what happens. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. Wait a minute. This guy is a trusted advisor to the king, and when the king's son decides he's going to rebel against the king's son calls David's trusted advisor and says, come help me, and the guy goes? Why? Why would he do such a thing? That's crazy. Well, here's what happens next. David flees Jerusalem because Absalom's coming, and he thinks Absalom's going to try and take him out. So he flees Jerusalem, and he prays against Ahithophel. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. How many have been to Jerusalem? You ever been there? You know, right outside of Jerusalem is the Kidron Valley to the east, and then you go up this hill where all those graves are now. That's the Mount of Olives. David's heading out of town weeping. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And if you keep reading the account of this, it's very interesting. I mean, this should be a movie. Someone already made it a movie somewhere, I'm sure. But as David's leaving town, one of the Israelites is cursing at him and throwing stuff at him. And some of the guards of David said, you want us to take this guy out? And David says something like, no, leave him. I deserve this. Maybe the Lord sent this guy to punish me. Maybe the Lord told him to throw rocks at me. Leave him. So he's dejected, heading out of town. His own son is coming to take over his throne. Now, Absalom enters Jerusalem and asks for Ahithophel's advice. Here's what happens. Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." All I can say is, what? What? So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. What? How did this guy go so bad? Does he have some sort of vendetta against David? He's been his trusted advisor for so long. And then why is he telling him to do his own son to sleep with David's concubines in the full sight of everyone? Anyone know where we're going with this? Puzzle piece number 1. Let's take a look at that. I'm still asking the question, why did this guy do this? Here's puzzle piece number 1. Who was Ahithophel? We got to figure out who this guy was first, right? If you go to 2 Samuel 23, so this is like 8 chapters later in 2 Samuel. There's just a list of who was a bodyguard for David. Among the 30 of David's bodyguards were Eliam, son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite, and Uriah the Hittite. Does anyone recognize this name? Who's Uriah the Hittite? Uriah the Hittite is the husband of Bathsheba. All right, keep that in mind. So, but this guy, Eliam, is the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. So the son of Ahithophel and Uriah must know one another. They're in a small group of 30 bodyguards. They know one another. Keep that in mind. Okay. Next puzzle piece. Who was this guy, Eliam, son of Ahithophel? One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Can anyone see the connection yet? Yeah. What's the connection? Who is Ahithophel?
Father-in-law.
Huh?
He was the grandfather-in-law.
Of?
Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba. Do you see why Ahithophel is annoyed with David and has a vendetta against David? Check this out. Let's take a look at the bloodline here. Here's Ahithophel, here's Eliam, and here's Bathsheba. David, his son Absalom. Ahithophel is the trusted counselor of David. His son Eliam is a bodyguard for David. And so is Uriah the Hittite. Well, Uriah and Eliam must be friends. Eliam says, "I have a beautiful daughter. Maybe you should meet." So they do. And Uriah becomes wedded to Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba on the roof. And what then does he do to Uriah? He sends him into battle. Not just he send him into battle, he tells the others, "You push him ahead, so he'll surely die." And you know the story? He first sends for Uriah. His first plan is to send for Uriah and have Uriah lay with Bathsheba, so the baby conceived as a result of David and Bathsheba, Uriah will think it's his baby. That's his first solution. But when Uriah comes home and David says, "Why don't you go in and sleep with your wife?" what does Uriah say? He won't do it. Why won't he do it? Yes, how can I be in here with my wife when my brethren are fighting in the war? That wouldn't be right. That wouldn't be fair. So David couldn't get this honorable man to go in and lie with his wife. So plan B, kill him. David takes out Uriah. David just took out Ahithophel's grandson-in-law. Just took him out. Now, I don't know if Bathsheba has any kids at this point, but Grandpa's in here. If somebody messes with your granddaughter's husband like this, you're not going to be happy about it, are you? So, Ahithophel is thinking, when am I going to have a chance to get back at David? Well, what happens is, as soon as Absalom rebels, Absalom knows this, he says to Ahithophel, why don't you come with me? So he does, but David outsmarts him. What does David do? David sends in a double agent, Hushai. Hushai goes down to Absalom and makes Absalom believe he's with Absalom, but in reality he's working for David. And instead of taking Ahithophel's advice, Absalom takes Hushai's advice, and Ahithophel at that point knows that it's going to be disaster for Absalom. And now he's left out in the cold, because once Absalom's either deposed or killed, David's going to say, why did you do this? So what does Ahithophel do? The text says he got his affairs in order and killed himself. But now go back. Why do you think he said to Absalom, sleep with your father's concubines on the roof? On the roof. On the roof. Same thing David did with Bathsheba. At least he saw her on the roof. You see the connection now? Now, you got to be some sort of super detective. I didn't come up with all this. J.J. Blunt came up with it. I mean, to see all these interconnections, I mean, these are just minor references somewhere else in the scriptures. You wouldn't see all these connections. In fact, how many of these so-called undesigned coincidences or elaborate testimonies are there? This man is J.J. Blunt, or this is his book. Again, the book's written 150 years ago. The title was Undesigned Coincidences in the Writings, both of the Old and New Testament, an argument for the veracity, with an appendix containing undesigned coincidences between the Gospels, Acts, and Josephus. So this guy's writing 150 years ago, and here's what he includes in this book. He has 68 of these things, like Ahithophel and David from the Old Testament. He has 43 between the Gospels and Acts. That's just the Gospels and Acts. That's nothing to do with the epistles or anything else, just Gospels and Acts. And he has 22 interlocking puzzle pieces between the Gospels and Acts and Josephus. He doesn't have anything about Tacitus or Suetonius or any of these other things. Now, you can download this book for free on the internet if you want to, because the copyright's over with.
So I want to do one more of Frank Turek before we actually move on to kind of back into our presentation. It's just that he does a good job with these. It's interesting if you actually go into 2 Samuel and you read through and you see how that's all put together. Ahithophel actually told Absalom to go out after David right away. When David was leaving Jerusalem, he was leaving with families and everything else and was not actually prepared for war. And so Ahithophel knew that, and he told Absalom, he said, look, you need to go right now and get him. And, and then Hushai, who David left behind specifically to be a spy and to counteract Ahithophel's counsel, he said, oh, I don't know if that's a great idea. And so when he presented, he said, look, and he really played to Absalom's inexperience as a king, and also his naive and self-centered attention for flattery. And he said, look, because he knew Absalom was insecure as a younger guy, was trying to gain some supremacy through this coup, and told him, look, he says, you know your father's going to be prepared. You know that when you go out to get him, he's going there's no way you'll overcome him. He's a warrior. He's separated. He's got a place now. I'm sure of it. And you know how cunning he is and everything else. And he says, here's what you should do. You should wait, gather up men from all over Israel so that you go out with these overwhelming numbers. And then when you defeat your father, everybody will be there. In other words, he was playing on Absalom's ego, really, and his insecurity. So he liked that counsel better than Ahithophel's, and Ahithophel realized, you know what, we're done with. So that's when he went home and hung himself. So anyways, here's Frank Turek has one more of these presentations, and then we'll move on.
Finally, one more. Number 8. How many times have you heard people trying to explain when Jesus asks John, do you love me? Do you love me more? You remember that at the end of the book of John? Well, here's what John says. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, the puzzle here, for me anyway, is why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than the others do? Well, he did deny him 3 times, but what did Peter say long before then? You're not going to get it from John. You got to go over to Matthew, because Matthew solves John. Peter answered him, though they will all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. So Matthew records, though John does not, Peter's boast that he was the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. So Jesus, after all this has occurred, asks them, so do you love me more than these? You said you wouldn't fall away. You don't get it from one. You got to get it from the other to fill in the detail. So not only does John solve Luke, and Luke solves John, and Luke solves Matthew twice, Mark solves Luke, John solves Mark, Mark solves Matthew, Matthew solves John. There's no way this is an invented story. You couldn't do this. This is too obscure. All these details, you got to look all over the place to try and put them all together. You need the box top to the puzzle. This is putting together an amazing puzzle. So, what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? I think that fictions and forgeries aren't like this. For example, why leave loose ends or raise puzzling questions if you're trying to pass off a lie as the truth, right? There's so many puzzling questions when you look at this. You go, look, if they were really trying to pass off a lie as the truth, they wouldn't let this happen. They would answer all these puzzling questions. Secondly, how can you control what other people will write to make it interlock with what you've written? You can't control. In fact, we'll see next week, not only does this happen internally between the Gospels, there are writers outside the Gospels that interlock with the Gospels, like Josephus and Suetonius and Tacitus, these Jewish and Roman writers. They're writing stuff that interlocks with the New Testament writers. They're called external undesigned coincidences. These are internal undesigned coincidences. Also, this is what actual history, it seems to me, is like. The New Testament writers obviously didn't copy from one another. If they did, if they copied from one another, the accounts would be all the same, right? There wouldn't be these inconsistencies. Passing details interlock in authentic, detailed records told by different people who saw the same real events or knew those that did. Now, do you remember my friend Jim Wallace, who was in here last December? The cold case homicide detective who's been on Dateline 4 times for solving cold case murders that are 30 years old. Well, he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, where he looks at eyewitness details. He's great at eyewitness testimony because that's what he does for a living. In fact, he and I do several seminars together now. But in this book, he writes about this way. He says, the early believers could have destroyed all but one of the accounts, changed the conflicting details, or simply harmonized the Gospels, but these diverse accounts were preserved as they are because they are true. They display all the earmarks we would expect in true eyewitness testimony. If the early church had eliminated the 4 eyewitness perspectives and limited us to one tidy version, we would inevitably miss some significant detail. So this is exactly what you expect when you have eyewitnesses. You all agree on the same story. You may disagree over the details, but when you look at the details together, then you can figure out a more complete picture. And sometimes the details appear to be contradictory. In fact, go back to the Titanic. Did I ever tell you the Titanic story? When the Titanic sank in 1912, some of the survivors said the Titanic went down whole. Other survivors said it broke in two before it went down. What did they all agree on? It went down. What did they disagree on? A detail, how it went down. Now, are we to say, well, since they disagreed on how it went down, we can't believe the Titanic sank? No, of course not. That's what they all agree on. The same thing is true in the New Testament documents. The New Testament documents all agree on what? Jesus died and rose again. They may disagree, at least it appears anyway, on who got to the tomb first, how many angels were at the tomb, these kind of details, but they all agree on the resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection. They're not inventing this. They're just doing what eyewitnesses do. Now, by the way, there's a difference between a contradiction and a difference. Differences are not always contradictions. So you just got to look at each one of them and see if they are contradictory or if they're just different.
So, as we get to the place of answering critics about the New Testament, I think that the presentations that Turek did were very good, and I'll give you some more information, but I think we need to realize that sometimes people discount the credibility of the New Testament or some aspect of it because of what they hear in a class or what they see on TV or what somebody quotes. And they're little slogans or phrases that somebody repeats, somebody else says them or whatever. You have to actually deal with people that do this for a living. You have to actually look into the documents. There are people that examine manuscripts, historical literature, and everything else, and they're the ones that put the effort into it. There are historians and archaeologists that dig this stuff up, so we don't want to be too cliche and just passing it off as though because we may not believe in the resurrection, we may not believe in Jesus, that all of a sudden the Bible has no credibility or whatever. That's just false. That's not true. As ancient historical documents go, this is the most verifiable one on the planet in our history. So we want to be accurate when we talk about that. Now, in answering New Testament critics, the charge that the New Testament manuscripts have multiple errors is a misleading statement. Now, we've talked about this. This is a little review. Though that statement is factually correct, that there is a lot of errors, right? What does it in fact tell us? First of all, any variance in spelling as a reminder of words, they're considered an error. There are 150 to 200,000 variants in over 26,000 partial manuscripts of the New Testament, depending upon scholars referenced, okay? All these variants, there are only 50 of these errors that have any real significance, but none affect doctrine. 99% hold no significance. So none of the differences are going to teach something doctrinally different than somewhere else in the New Testament. There are 36,000 quotes from the early church fathers that the New Testament can be assembled from, with only 11 verses really not quoted. So these are facts. Let's see how the majority of the errors are documented. Again, this is review. Here is an example of what the majority of errors represent. Manuscript 1, Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world is misspelled. Instead of Jesus Christ, says Christ Jesus in another document. And another one, it would just lack the I in is. It would say Jesus Christ and then just the S. Jesus Christ is, and then the and whole are not spelled correctly. And then finally, Jesus Christ is the Savior of the whole, and then world is spelled differently, incorrectly than the first example. So this is an example of a modern comparison of the similar type of errors, right? And we've seen this. You've won $10 million, and then you lose a letter somewhere. But with the mistakes, nobody misunderstands what's being said. The message comes through 100%. The more errors, actually, the more sure you are of the message, because it's not only been copied and passed around, but you know that you didn't have just one copy that could be wrong. So anyways, we've talked about this. Really, question is, would you collect your money? Of course you would. Now, statistics can be deceitful if they're used deceitfully. You've won $10 million, right? As you go through this, thou hast won $10 million. Y'all have won $10 million, right? Of 27 letters in line 2, only 7 are the same in line 3. So this shows you how statistically you can make a claim. It's like if this was a New Testament document comparatively with another one, you'd say, man, there's of 27 letters in line 2, only 7 are the same in line 3. So basically 26% are the same. Yet the message is 100% identical. And this is how statistics can be used deceitfully, because sometimes, agnostic or atheistic scholars get into this to try to discredit the manuscripts of the New Testament, and they'll make claims like, oh, there's only a small percentage that agrees with the other. Well, and that may be technically correct at certain points, but it is not accurately representing what the evidence bears out. And that's the problem, because a lot of people do not really look into any of this. They don't actually understand how the New Testament was transmitted, and so they come to these erroneous conclusions, and oftentimes by listening to people who are deliberately, and they know better, misstating the actual details. So they're different in form, but not in content, as far as this example. And even with the many differences, 100% of the message still comes through, right? And many New Testament variations are just like this. They're spelling errors, the sentences are reversed or whatever, or the grammar is a little bit different. But those all, you do that in 2,000 manuscripts, that's 2,000 errors, but it doesn't change what it's actually saying. Simon Wenham, he did a good job. He actually wrote an article that was in the Zacharias Trust magazine, and he gave answers to the 5 strongest arguments against the reliability of the New Testament. So I kind of briefed them down here. The first objection is the New Testament was written decades after Jesus' death, and we don't even know who some of the authors were. Well, the answer is this, that there is a very good case for accepting the earliest description of Mark's gospel to Mark, a companion of Peter and of Paul, and of Luke's to Luke, Paul's companion. If you wanted to invent an author for these important records, you would surely go for people who that are more directly linked to Jesus, such as Peter. In other words, you wouldn't be extending it to Mark, you wouldn't be extending it to Luke, who were companions of apostles, but not apostles themselves. So obviously, these people knew Jesus, the apostles did, and then providing the information to the writers. I mean, if you wanted to just fabricate it, the last thing you would do is try to make it even appear as though it was somebody else that was perhaps indirect. It's wrong to consider that there was a gap between the events of Jesus' lifetime and the writing of the Gospels. During those years, the first Christians were crisscrossing the Greco-Roman world, telling people about Jesus and inviting them to believe in him. So this is really, I think, Wenham does a good job, and these are pretty simple. So for additional information and further research, if you're interested, Geisler and Turk's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, they give carefully researched and documented information in chapters 9 to 11 on the following subjects. Chapter 9, do we have early testimony about Jesus, right? Chapter 10, do we have eyewitness testimony about Jesus? And 11, the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. So again, this is just if you want to actually dig in and get further information. The second objection, the Bible is full of mistakes and the accounts don't even agree with each other. Now, we saw some of that. Obviously, when you have real eyewitnesses, you can't just look on the surface. You actually have to do a little work and put some elbow grease into it. But the answer is the differences between the gospel accounts have long been recognized by scholars, and a vast amount has been written on how and why this is the case. Having different witnesses is important, as in a court of law. If all the witnesses said exactly the same thing, then we might well suspect that they had colluded. But if they came at things from different angles, then their combined testimony is all the stronger. Luke shows that he was interested in historical events. Luke writes a lot and names a lot of places and people. Furthermore, other information he has given has been substantiated, such as his description of Gallio as the governor of Corinth, as confirmed by an inscription found in the Greek city of Delphi. So again, if you want additional information, Colin Hemmer's book, The Book of Acts, in the setting of Hellenistic history, provides the 84 facts that I showed earlier. They show Luke was an eyewitness in the second half of Acts, confirmed by historical and archaeological research. This is work that Hemmer put together that helps provide legitimate historicity for the Book of Acts. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, and Turek mentioned him too, Professor J.J. Blunt, and Turek mentioned that you can get his book online, and you can if you go to archive.org and then you look him up. It's definitely worth the read. So the third objection is there are no external records to corroborate it, meaning the New Testament. The answer, there is external evidence of interest. Josephus, Jewish historian, right, is a highly significant witness. Although his reference to Jesus may have been altered, he provided a wealth of information about the religious climate of the time, as well as some of the individuals mentioned in the Bible, ranging from the Pharisees and Herod to Pilate and John the Baptist. And we saw some of those quotes with Turek. There are also other types of external sources that corroborate details within the Bible, including archaeological finds. The Pool of Siloam, I showed you that earlier, on an earlier presentation. An inscription referring to Pilate, which I showed you. The bones of Caiaphas, showed you that. Also geological evidence that fits what the Bible describes. So there's plenty of archaeological evidence. If the Bible was telling you things that were false, every time they uncovered something from an archaeological dig in that area, it would only be a verification against its authenticity, not in support. And yet every single time it's only supportive and it's never contradictory. So additional research for this. Again, this table, though you can't really read it here, appears in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And it lists many of the external records that corroborate the New Testament. Even this table is not exhaustive in what exists to give corroboration to the New Testament, but it is an example that they put in the book. Number 4, they are highly biased documents that were only selected by the church later on. Answer: there is no doubt that the authors were enthusiastic believers who wanted to persuade others. Hello, right? But if someone ardently believes something, it does not follow that they will therefore distort the truth. At least we would hope not, right? On the contrary, I mean, especially if you're promoting a book that talks about, being honorable, faithful, not lying, accountable to God, right? So, you're going to run out there and lie? That's ridiculous. On the contrary, the strength of their feeling is likely to be a reflection of the desire to which they believe it to be true, as well as the importance they attach to it. Furthermore, the Gospels contain various things that the writers might have been expected to hush up, such as the very blunt portrayal of the disciples' failures, right? The embarrassing testimony, like Peter disowning Jesus. There are other signs of authenticity too, like the portrayal of women as the first eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. I mean, who would do that if they were trying to promote this? Not something likely to be invented in a male-dominated culture. So again, we have additional research. Chapter 11 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist gives you information on that. Later centuries manuscripts of the New Testament text cannot change earlier ones from the 1st and 2nd century. And I think that we need to realize this. A lot of times, you hear people say, oh, they changed it all, hundreds of years later. What, are you kidding me? You can't go back and change scrolls. I mean, what do you think? This is a computer program that you just print out a different document? That's not possible. You would have to go through thousands of ancient manuscripts and somehow scrub them and adjust them. What do you think this is? Like you grab an eraser and just rewrite it? That's nonsense. Later century manuscripts of the New Testament text cannot change earlier ones from the 1st and 2nd century. Church councils didn't alter what was written and kept the same New Testament books as passed down from the 1st century church. Had they wanted to alter the New Testament in any way, they were a miserable failure because they kept embarrassing details that remain in the text until the current time. These details no one would include if they were altering the text. There's no way. I mean, look, they have 9th and 10th century manuscript copies in the original language Greek that they can match back to 2nd century copies of the same, and there's no change. And again, it's not like, the church fathers and the 3rd and 4th centuries said, hey, let's go back and do some revisionism and all that stuff. That just didn't occur. That wasn't even possible for it to occur. So the 5th objection, miracles don't happen. The answer: history may not be able to tell us whether something had a supernatural cause, but it can help us assess whether it is likely to have occurred. To dismiss the first Christians as ancient people who believed anything and everything is insulting and completely unsatisfactory. They knew as well as we do that executed people remain dead, obviously. The idea that a hallucination persuaded them otherwise, or indeed that they perpetuated a giant fraud, is not persuasive. The much simpler and straightforward explanation is that those who claim to have seen Jesus after his death had indeed done so. The suspicion must be that much modern skepticism arises out of a questionable naturalistic philosophy rather than out of a serious study of the New Testament. Look, if you can verify that these documents were transmitted accurately and that they told the truth, number 2, and if that truth is that they believe, these writers believe that they saw Jesus Christ raised from the dead. Now, you can say that you don't think that they actually saw that or they were mistaken or whatever, but they actually believed that that's what they saw. They believed they saw the person that was dead alive again. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can look at this, but the bottom line is that if the Romans had the body, they would have presented it. If the Jews had the body, they would have presented it. And the only other people were the believers, the Christians, the early believers who were actually afraid. But let's say they stole the body. Why would they die? Why do people go to their death claiming something that they know is a lie and a fabrication? That's absurd. Now, would maybe one or a couple of people do it because there was something wrong with them? Possibly. But you don't have thousands of people do it. I mean, there were hundreds of people that saw Jesus raise up after he was crucified and buried 3 days. So now, you don't have to believe that, but not believing it does not make it not true. And we need to recognize that too. So again, for further information, chapter 11 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And then in conclusion, the New Testament is historically reliable, right? It is fact and not fiction. Number 2, accurate early eyewitness testimony. We saw that. Number 3, documents and events recorded accurately. We saw that. The transmission of the documents is what we call that. There's more manuscript support than any other historical document. I mean, these are just facts, and that's the way it was laid out and presented. Earlier manuscript support than any other historical document. So there's more and there's earlier. It's closer to the source than any other. If it says Jesus said it, then Jesus really said it. In other words, this is the conclusion you come to. And if it says Jesus did it, then Jesus really did it. So what we're going to stop now, but what we will go into on the next presentation is actually a response to the particular allegations made against the Bible on the atheist.org website, because they've actually gone through, picked out things that they think are contradictions in the Bible, which is why it could not be God's word, that does not have any errors in it. And so we'll jump into that next time. So until then, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.